when I decided to leave my own son's house. I wasn't being kicked out. I just couldn't stand being the reason for his fights anymore. My name is Helena. I am 68 years old, and for 3 years, I lived in my son and daughter-in-law's house. Many people think that leaving a child's home at that age only happens because of ingratitude, a nasty fight, or abandonment. But that wasn't the case for me. I was never directly mistreated. I never heard a harsh word directed at me. I was never kicked out. And perhaps that's why it hurt so much. I felt it every day. I could feel it in the way the conversation changed when I entered the room, in the silence that stretched on too long after a simple sentence, in my son's exaggerated care in measuring his words, in my daughter-in-law's deep sigh when I asked something that in my mind was insignificant. I didn't need anyone to say anything. The atmosphere spoke for itself. I noticed they argued less when I wasn't around, that they laughed more quietly, that they resolved important matters in their room with the door closed, and that, when they did fight, my name would come up in the middle of the conversation, like a burden no one wanted to bear. I never heard shouts directed at me, but I heard broken sentences. I heard my son defending himself. I heard my daughter-in-law falling silent. I heard their marriage growing weary. And worst of all, I heard silence afterwards. That's when I understood that the problem was never what they said to me. It was what they said among themselves. I started sleeping badly, feeling too big for that space, measuring every step, every request, every presence. And when you start calculating your own existence, something is already wrong. On the day I packed my things, no one kicked me out. No one raised their voice. No one asked me to leave. But I left anyway. Because sometimes loving means realizing that staying hurts more than leaving. I always say that being a mother was the most beautiful and most difficult thing in my life. My son was born when I was still very young, full of fear and full of courage at the same time. I didn't have much money. I didn't have a stable life, but I had one certainty. He would never feel alone in the world. I raised my son practically alone. His father left early, when he was still too young to understand absence. So it was me who stayed. Me and God. Me and the responsibility of being everything at once. Comfort, boundaries, protection, strength. I worked at whatever jobs came my way. There were years when the refrigerator was always empty, but I always found a way to smile at him. I didn't want him to grow up feeling the weight of hardship. I carried it for both of us. I remember the sleepless nights, the silent worries, the fear of getting sick and having no one to take care of him. I remember promising myself that whatever happened, he would never feel like a burden. Never. Perhaps that's why I grew up with this fear inside me, the fear of being a burden to those I love. When he grew up, studied, worked, and built his own life, I felt pride, a pride that overflows my heart. Seeing my son become a good man was proof that everything was worth it. Then came his marriage, a proper, organized woman, different from me in many ways. I respected that. I always respected it. I never wanted to compete for space. I never wanted to be in charge. I knew my place. Years later, my life changed suddenly. I became a widow. The house became too big. The silence became too heavy. My son insisted that I come live with them. He said it was care, that it was family, that it was temporary. I resisted at first, not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear of getting in the way. Fear of intruding. Fear of losing that safe place I had earned, that of a respected yet independent mother. I ended up accepting. I thought it would be good for everyone. I thought love was enough. From day one, I made a point of being discreet. I didn't want to impose a routine. I didn't want opinions. I helped where I could, and stepped away when I realized I didn't fit in. I always believed that love also means knowing when to slow down. But inside me, that old fear slowly awakened. The fear of being too much. The fear of taking up too much space. The fear of needing too much. I looked at my son and saw the same boy I had protected from the whole world. But now he had a different life, different commitments, different priorities. And that's natural. I understood, or I thought I understood. What I didn't know yet was that my greatest fear was about to come true. At first, I tried to believe that everything was all right, that that house could also be my home, that I still had a place there even if it was small, even if it was discreet. I used to wake up early, before everyone else. I'd always done it that way. An old habit. I'd quietly make coffee, wash dishes that weren't even dirty, organize things that nobody had asked me to organize. Not out of obligation, but to justify my presence. To prove every day that I wasn't a burden. I avoided taking up space. I didn't turn the television up loud. I didn't leave my things scattered around. I didn't invite anyone over. If I felt pain, I kept it to myself. If I felt sadness, I swallowed it. I helped in any way I could, folding clothes, making simple meals, taking care of small details. Always asking first, always careful not to overstep any invisible boundaries. My daughter-in-law was never rude to me, and perhaps that's what hurt the most. She was proper, polite, cold. She would answer with a with "we'll see later," with silences that were too long. She never raised her voice. She never offended me, but she also never welcomed me. Their eyes spoke louder than words. A sigh when I entered the kitchen. A heavy silence when I sat down in the living room. A curt reply when I asked something simple. I started to feel like I was going through a place that wasn't mine. My son was trying to find balance. I could see it. Sometimes he smiled more than he needed to. Sometimes he got irritated for no reason. Sometimes he spoke loudly over small things. And that's when I started to realize their arguments never started with me. And they never ended with me in the conversation. But somehow, I was always in the middle of it. You left the towel wet again. I was tired. Everything has changed since your mother came to live here. I could hear it from my room. Always from my room. The tone was never one of hatred. It was one of weariness. I would sit on the bed, my hands in my lap, trying to breathe quietly so as not to make a sound. As if even the air I inhaled could be bothersome. I started counting how many times my name came up in their conversations. Never directly, always as context, always as a secondary reason, always as something that needed to be resolved. And that hurts in a way that's impossible to explain. Because no one was accusing me, but I felt guilty. I started going out more, wandering aimlessly, sitting on park benches just to avoid being there. I'd come home late, feigning tiredness, to go straight to my room. Sometimes I would hear the heavy silence after an argument. Other times, I would hear doors being slammed shut more forcefully than necessary. My son never came to talk to me, and I never asked, because, deep down, I already knew. I was the common ground. I was the new variable in that equation that had worked before. I was the adjustment that nobody knew how to make. And that's when I realized it, that something inside me started to break. I wasn't mistreated, but I wasn't welcome either. I wasn't expelled, but I wasn't included either. And living in this middle ground is more tiring than outright rejection. One night, I heard a rather loud argument. No shouting, but the silence that followed was deafening. My name was called, low, tired, and there, sitting on the bed, my heart aching as if it were being crushed, I understood something that changed everything. I was never called into a fight, but I was always in the middle of it. And at that moment, something inside me began to make a decision, still silent, still painful but definitive. The discussion began like so many others, quiet, restrained, the kind that tries not to wake the whole house but wakes up those who were already on alert. I was in the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. The radio was off, the light was off, when my daughter-in-law's voice became a little firmer. It wasn't screaming, it was exhaustion. I can't stand living like this anymore. My heart gave a sharp leap in my chest. My son responded too quickly, in a defensive, almost automatic tone. She is my mother. Silence. That kind of silence that weighs more than any answer. Then came the phrase I should never have heard. But I did. I know. And that's exactly what's driving us apart. I put my hand to my mouth, not to stop myself from crying, but to stop myself from breathing too loudly. They kept talking, not about me directly, but everything revolved around me. Space, privacy, tiredness, future. My name wasn't repeated, but I was in every unspoken word. My son tried to explain. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of gratitude. He spoke of everything I had done for him. And every word he said, it cut me to the core. Because I didn't want to be an argument. I didn't want to be a shield. I didn't want to be a source of friction. I wanted to be a mother. That's all. My daughter-in-law's voice grew lower, more tired, more sad than angry. I don't hate her. But I don't know how to live like this. That's where something broke down completely. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was shameful. Shameful to be there. Ashamed to occupy a space that wasn't mine. Ashamed to be loved to the point of causing pain. I sat on the bed with my shoulders slumped, feeling a pain that had no name. It wasn't physical pain. It was the pain of realizing that my son's love was costing me too much. They fell silent after that. A heavy silence. A definitive one. I didn't hear doors slamming. I didn't hear hurried footsteps. Just that emptiness, spreading throughout the entire house. And there, alone in the dark, I understood something that changed everything inside me. His love for me was hurting his marriage. And no mother's love should do that. I didn't cry out loud. I didn't pray. I didn't get up. I sat there, staring into nothingness, feeling a guilt that no one had placed on me but which I carried entirely. At that moment, I knew. I didn't need to be expelled. I needed to leave, not for them, but for him, and for me. Because sometimes loving means knowing when not to stay. After that night, I began to exist in silence within my own home. Not because someone asked me to, but because I no longer knew how to fill that space without hurting someone. The next day, I woke up before everyone else. I made coffee as usual. I tidied the kitchen with the same care. I folded the towels, cleaned the table, and swept the floor. Everything is the same, and at the same time, everything is different. I felt like I was stepping on ground that was no longer mine. Each step seemed to apologize. My son looked at me affectionately, but in a hurry. My daughter-in-law spoke to me politely, but from a distance. And I did everything I could to avoid being noticed. I started eating less, leaving my room less, speaking only when necessary, not out of pride, out of care. At night, when the house fell silent, I would relive that conversation in my head. Every sentence, every pause, every tired sigh. I wondered to myself, in a low voice, as if I were talking to myself, did I make a mistake in agreeing to live here? Should I have refused? Did I confuse acceptance with permanent residency? I remembered when he was little, when I would wake up in the middle of the night to check if he was breathing, when I skipped meals so he wouldn't feel hungry, when I swallowed my own dreams so he could dream. But, for the first time, I didn't use it as an argument within myself. Because love isn't about demanding something. Love isn't about debt. Love isn't a memory used as a burden. I didn't want him to choose between me and his wife. I never wanted that. The idea of being put in that position caused me more pain than any loneliness. I could see his effort to please both sides, and I could clearly see that it was tearing him apart inside. And somehow I knew, if someone had to give up something, it would be me. I spent days like that, observing, feeling, saying goodbye in silence. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I simply withdrew into myself. I cried alone a few times. I cried for what was. I cried for what would never be. I cried from the pain of realizing that, even though I was loved, I no longer belonged there. And it was in that pain, quiet, deep, honest, that a phrase formed within me, clearer than ever. I don't want to be chosen. I want him to be happy. At that moment, something changed. Guilt began to give way to decisiveness. Fear began to turn into courage. And sadness began to organize itself in the form of care. I understood that staying there, hoping things would get better, was comfortable for me, but unfair to them. I needed to do something, not to be a hero, but to be a mother. Because being a mother sometimes isn't about staying. It's about leaving before love turns to resentment. And that night, sitting on the edge of my bed, I made the hardest decision of my life. I was going to leave, not running away, not fighting, not accusing. I would leave in silence, just as I lived there, with love, and with pain, but with dignity. I didn't sleep that night, not because of anxiety, but because, when we make a final decision, the body understands before the mind can rest. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of the room my son had prepared for me when I arrived. A simple, clean room, lovingly arranged. Nothing there was hostile. Nothing there was cruel. And yet, I knew I needed to leave. I got up slowly so as not to wake anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed and started to separate my things. There weren't many. Some clothes, my medicine, old photos, a rosary that had been with me since my youth, and a small box with mementos I'd never shown anyone. Each object seemed to ask if I was sure, and I answered silently. I was. It wasn't an escape. It was a choice. The next morning, I made coffee as usual. I set the table carefully. I waited for my son to wake up. When he came into the kitchen, still sleepy, he smiled at me. That smile I'd known since childhood. The same smile he had when he fell and got up crying. The same smile he had when he proudly showed me a crooked drawing. My heart tightened, but I took a deep breath. Son, can we talk for a little bit? He realized immediately that something was different. He sat down. He looked at me intently. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I spoke as someone who had already overcome the pain and now just needed to tell the truth. I know you've been working very hard. I see the tiredness in your eyes. I hear things you think I don't hear. He tried to interrupt me. Mom, that's not it. You're misunderstanding. I raised my hand gently. I'm not. I understand more than you think. He remained silent. I continued. I know you love me. I never doubted that. But I also know that my presence here has become a burden you don't know how to carry without hurting someone. His eyes began to well up with tears. Don't talk like that, Mom. You're not a burden at all. I approached him. I held his hands. Not for you, but for the life you're trying to build. Maybe it is. He lowered his head. And that gesture confirmed everything I needed to know. Then I said the phrase I had rehearsed all night inside myself. I'd rather feel longing than continue being the cause of your pain. He quickly raised his face. Are you saying you're leaving? I nodded. I've already decided. He tried to argue. We'll figure something out. I'll talk to her. You can't just go out like that. And there, for the first time, I saw my son as a man. Confused, torn, trying to please everyone. That's why I kept calm. Son, listen to your mother. If you talk to her because of me, the problem won't end. It just changes location. He cried. Me too, but without despair. I'm not leaving because I'm not loved. I'm leaving because I love you enough not to put you in this position. He hugged me tightly, just like when I was little, as if he wanted to hold me in time. You always think of others, he said, his voice breaking. And I replied, resting my forehead against his. This time, I'm thinking of everyone, including myself. There was no fight. There were no accusations. There was no villain. That's the truth. I packed my things that same day. My daughter-in-law helped me quietly. Polite, reserved. There was no hatred between us. There was discomfort. And that hurts too. Before leaving, I looked at the house one last time. Every corner held a trace of my effort not to disturb. Every gesture of mine had been an attempt to fit in. At the door, my son hugged me again. Are you sure, ma'am? I smiled, with that tired smile of someone who already knows. I have, because, deep down, I understood something that took me a lifetime to learn. Sometimes, the greatest proof of love is leaving before love turns into guilt. And when I walked through that door, I took two things with me. An immense pain, and an intact dignity. I wasn't being expelled. I was choosing myself. And at that moment, that was all I needed. The first few days alone were the hardest. The silence of the new house wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence that echoed memories. Every empty corner seemed to ask why I had left. And for a few moments, I even wondered if I had done the right thing. Longing came before peace. I missed the noise of a full house. The sound of the television on even when no one was actually watching. The smell of coffee brewing in the morning while my son got ready to go out. Even the little tensions, the ones that hurt, but still made me feel present. There were nights when I cried softly, sitting on the edge of the bed, not out of regret, but out of grief. Grief from daily interaction. Grief from the illusion that I could grow old there, close by, without feeling any regret. Grief of a mother accepting that her son has grown up, and that her place in his life has changed. But gradually, something different began to happen. I started breathing better. I no longer needed to measure every step. I no longer needed to calculate every word. I no longer needed to ask permission to exist. I started waking up without that tightness in my chest that I felt every morning, wondering if there would be another argument because of me that day. There were no more sideways glances, nor silences full of unspoken things. Yes, There was loneliness, but there was lightness too. And this lightness showed me that I hadn't left out of weakness. I had left out of love and self-respect. My son started calling me more calmly. It wasn't that quick call anymore, full of rush and guilt. He would ask how I was. He would listen to the answer. He would tell me about his life without tension in his voice. The visits became different. When I went to their house, I was no longer part of the problem. I was a visitor, a guest, expected. The conversation flowed better. The atmosphere was lighter. My daughter-in-law treated me with genuine politeness, not the forced politeness that comes from obligation, but the kind that stems from healthy distance. And most importantly, I stopped feeling like I had to choose between being a mother and being a person. I started to rebuild my routine. I started organizing my schedule. I made friends with a neighbor. I went back to walking in the park. I began taking care of my things without rushing, without guilt. For the first time in a long time, my decisions didn't need to go through the filter of will this bother someone? And that changes everything. I realized that for years, I had confused love with annihilation. I believed that to love was to endure. It was to stay. It was to adapt until disappearing. But it isn't. Love that hurts in silence isn't care. It's exhaustion. I didn't abandon my son. I gave him back the chance to live his marriage without guilt. And I gave myself back the right to exist without apologizing. Today, when I look back, I don't feel pride in the pain, but I do feel respect for the woman I was at that time. The woman who understood that she didn't need to be chosen, that she didn't need to compete, that she didn't need to prove anything. All he had to do was withdraw with dignity. Because sometimes to love is to stay, but sometimes to love is to leave the scene before love turns to resentment. And that's what I did. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. It wasn't without tears. But it was true. Today, when I close my front door at dusk, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Peace. A quiet, mature peace, without euphoria. The peace of someone who knows they haven't hurt anyone and haven't hurt themselves anymore. Sometimes I feel homesick. Of course I do. But longing is different from guilt. And on that day when I left my own son's house, I lost daily contact with him, but I gained something that no one can take away from me. The certainty that I loved without hurting, and I respected myself without hardening my heart. And that, for me, was liberating enough. For a long time, I thought love was constant presence. That caring meant staying. That being a mother meant enduring everything, including one's own erasure. But life has taught me something that almost no one says out loud. Not all separation is abandonment. Sometimes it's care. Take care of those you love. And above all, take care of yourself. There are pains that make no sound. Pains that don't appear in harsh words or aggressive gestures. They live in awkward silences, in whispered arguments, in averted glances. And these pains hurt just the same. How many mothers live like this, walking on eggshells inside their own homes? Measuring every step so as not to disturb others, swallowing their tears so as not to get in the way. How many women grow old thinking that love is a debt, that they need to pay forever for having been mothers? I had to learn, quite late in life, that love isn't about demands. It's not about eternal sacrifice. It's not about disappearing so that others can have peace. True love doesn't demand that you diminish yourself. It doesn't ask you to choose between dignity and affection. It doesn't turn presence into a burden. If you're living in a place where your very existence generates guilt, maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe it's the place. And leaving in these cases is not a failure. It's maturity. I didn't stop loving my son when I left that house. I loved him in a more difficult way, by allowing him to be happy without carrying the weight of my presence. And I loved myself too, something I had forgotten I could do. If this story touched you, I ask you with affection, have you ever felt like a burden on the life of someone you love? Have you ever stayed silent so as not to get in the way? Have you ever had to leave a place, even though you loved it, to avoid getting hurt more? If so, know this: you are not alone, and your pain is valid. Share your story in the comments below. Like this video so it reaches more people. And subscribe to the channel, because here, we don't talk about abandonment. We talk about the pain that almost no one sees, the scars of love,